On the 28th of October, 1993, an 80-year-old woman died inside a gated house in Benedict Canyon, above Beverly Hills. Within a day, she had been cremated without an autopsy, and her ashes were scattered out into the Pacific. The man who arranged all of it was her butler. She had made him the executor of $1.2 billion. The Gate at Falcon Lair. Falcon Lair was the name of the house. Rudolph Valentino built it in the 1920s and died young, and by the time Doris Duke bought it in the 50s, it already had the reputation of a place where something had gone wrong. It sits up Benedict Canyon behind a gate, at the end of a curve of driveway, and for the last 2 years of her life, that gate was more or less the boundary of her world. She was 80. She had come out of a run of surgeries on the back of a fall, and into a routine of medication that people around her would later describe in sworn affidavits as leaving her confused. Her staff decided who came up the drive. On the 28th of October, 1993, she died in that house. What happened next is the reason anyone is still arguing about it. She was cremated inside a day before anyone outside the household could reasonably have asked a question. No autopsy was performed. The ashes were taken out and scattered in the Pacific. And the will that turned up, signed on the 5th of April that same year, named Bernard Lafferty, her butler, as the only individual executor of an estate, reported at around $1.2 billion. The will let him pick the bank that would serve alongside him, and it let him remove that bank if he chose to. Lafferty was 48. He had come from County Donegal. Reporters who dealt with him described a man who could barely read. He was also, by that point, the person who had decided for 2 years who spoke to one of the richest women alive. Her lawyers went through him. Her doctors went through him. Old friends who telephoned were told she was resting. Within 18 months, a judge in New York would strip him of the role. An appeals court would hand it back. A former Manhattan district attorney, appointed by the court to find out what had happened in that house, would report that her death had been hastened by morphine and that her mind at the signing had been questionable. The Los Angeles district attorney would investigate for about a year and a half. Nobody was ever charged with anything. Not the butler, not the doctor, not anyone. So that is the ending, and it is on the public record. Everything from here is how a person arrives at it, and the arrival starts 68 years earlier with a 12-year-old girl who woke up one morning as the most watched child in America. If you want the whole of it, subscribe now and it will find you. The richest girl in the world. Her father was James Buchanan Duke, and he had built 2 fortunes. The first was tobacco. He took a family business in North Carolina and turned it into the American Tobacco Company, which by the early 1900s controlled the overwhelming majority of the American market. In 1911, the Supreme Court ordered the trust broken up. It made less difference to the Dukes than anyone expected. He had already moved into hydroelectric power across the Carolinas, in the company that carries the family name to this day. In December of 1924, he set up the Duke Endowment, and a small college in Durham called Trinity agreed to rename itself after his family. That is where Duke University comes from. 10 months later, on the 10th of October, 1925, he died. The estate figures vary by source, between $60 and $100 million, with roughly $80 million commonly given as the portion that went to his only child. Adjust that into today's money, and you are somewhere well past $1 billion. His only child was 12 years old. The newspapers named her within days, the richest girl in the world. She would carry that phrase for the next 68 years, through 2 marriages, a war, a fatal crash, and a contested death, and it would appear in most of her obituaries. In practice, for a child in 1925, that meant several things at once. Photographers outside the school, kidnapping threats taken seriously enough to require guards, in the decade that would produce the Lindbergh case. A fortune held in trust she could not touch, controlled by adults whose interests were not identical to hers. Then there was the permanent audience. Every dress, every school, every holiday reported. She was a public figure at an age when most children are learning to swim, and she had done nothing to become one except survive her father. And then, in 1927, something happened that tells you almost everything about the rest of her life. A suit was filed on her behalf, against her own mother, to stop the sale of assets out of her father's estate. She was 14. She was in court. The defendant was her mother. The suit did its job and the assets stayed. She would gain real control of the money in stages through her 20s, as the trusts released at 21, 25, and 30. By 21, she had already set up a charitable foundation of her own, which is a strange instinct in a young woman of that era. And consider what that childhood taught her. Other children are protected from the adult world by their parents. She was protected from her mother by lawyers. By the time she was old enough to make her own decisions, she had already learned that the people closest to her were the people with the most to gain from her. Her father, according to family lore, had told her on his deathbed to trust nobody. There is no way to verify that line, and it may well be something the family constructed afterward. What can be verified is that she behaved for 70 years as though somebody had said it. Trust no one. The public version of the next 30 years is the one everyone knows, and it is mostly noise. She married James Cromwell in 1935, a politically ambitious American who would go on to be ambassador to Canada. They took a honeymoon that lasted 2 years. In Honolulu, she fell for a 5-acre site above the water near Diamond Head and built Shangri-La on it, filled over decades with one of the finest private collections of Islamic art in the country. The marriage ended in 1943. Her second husband was Porfirio Rubirosa, a Dominican diplomat with a considerable reputation, married in September of 1947. Sources disagree on when exactly it ended. Everyone agrees it was brief. During the war, she worked in a canteen for sailors in Egypt for $1 a year, and afterward took work as a foreign correspondent. She wrote from Europe. She had a serious ear for jazz and gospel, and spent real time in rooms where a woman of her description was not expected. She was a genuinely accomplished pianist and practiced twice a day for most of her life. After the Newport Jazz Festival, she would bring musicians back to the house to play, and she is said to have sat in at the festival itself without announcing who she was. She kept up the horticulture at Duke Farms, the 2,700-acre estate in New Jersey her father had built, and later put serious money into saving colonial houses in Newport, when the fashion was to knock them down. All of that is documented, and most of it is genuinely interesting, and none of it is the thing that shaped her. I have read a fair amount about this woman, and the biographies all have the same problem. They are full of events and empty of her. She is at the party, she buys the house, she leaves the husband, and what she made of any of it is guesswork, because she almost never said. The thing that shaped her happened on the 11th of July, 1940. Her daughter was born prematurely in Honolulu. She was named Arden. She lived one day and died on the 12th. Doris Duke was 27, and she was told afterward that she would not be able to have another child. Everything in the second half of her life reads differently once you know that. The houses she filled with objects, the people she gathered and dropped, the much later decision at 75 to legally adopt a woman in her 30s and call her a daughter. She had money enough to buy anything that could be bought, and the one thing she wanted had been settled by a doctor in 1940. By most accounts, she was not a warm woman, and she got less so as she went. She avoided the press with real determination. She traveled under other names. Almost nothing survives in her own words, which is a strange thing to be able to say about one of the most photographed women of the 20th century. What she did have by the middle of the 1960s was a small circle of people she paid. One of them was a designer named Eduardo Torella, and on a Friday evening in October of 1966, he got out from behind the wheel of her car to open a gate. The gate at Rough Point. Rough Point is a 49-room stone house on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, Rhode Island, built for Frederick Vanderbilt in the 1890s and bought by James Duke in 1922. Doris inherited it at 12, along with everything else, and she kept it for the rest of her life. Eduardo Torella was 42. He was a designer and an art curator. He had worked in Hollywood, and he had been close to Duke for about a decade, which by her standards was a long tenure. By the autumn of 1966, he had told her he was leaving to take film work in California. On the 7th of October, a little after 5 in the evening, the two of them were leaving Rough Point in a rented Dodge station wagon. Torella was driving. He pulled up at the closed gate, put the car in park, got out of the driver's seat and went to open it, and Duke slid across the bench seat behind the wheel. Then the car went forward. It struck him, carried him through the gate, across Bellevue Avenue, and into a tree. He was crushed, and he died there. On the 12th of October, 5 days later, the Newport police chief ruled it an unfortunate accident. No arrest, no charge, no inquest. Her account to the police chief was that the car suddenly leapt forward, and she was on top of him. Nothing emerged at the time to contradict it, largely because the investigation rested on her account and was wrapped up inside 4 days. In 1971, one of Torella's sisters brought a civil case. A jury found Duke negligent and awarded $75,000. After legal costs, split among his 8 surviving siblings, each of them came away with something in the region of $5,600. That figure sits oddly against the fortune it was assessed on. A man who spent 10 years in her employ died at her gate, under her car, and his entire family collectively received an amount she would not have noticed leaving her accounts. More than 50 years later, the journalist Peter Lance reopened the case, first in Vanity Fair and then in a book, arguing from the physical evidence and from witness accounts that the death had been no accident. Newport police went back over it. They reviewed the file, and in 2021, they closed it again, with a cold case detective stating that nothing new had emerged to change the original conclusion. The city stood behind that review. So the position today is exactly what it was in 1966, with one civil finding of negligence attached. Duke was never charged, and no court ever found she did it on purpose. The case for something worse belongs to Peter Lance, and it is his argument rather than a finding. At the trial in Providence, Duke took the stand and told the story again. A field investigator from the Motor Vehicle Registry testified that when he examined the car 3 days afterward, it could only travel about 10 feet in either direction because of what the crash had done to it. 60 years on, the mechanical questions are still where the whole argument lives. Everything else is inference. What is beyond dispute is what happened to her afterward. The friendships thinned, the staff turned over faster. She spent more time behind gates and less time with anyone who had known her before the money. She had 27 years left, and she would spend a good part of them trying to assemble a family out of people who worked for her. The daughter she unadopted. In 1985, she met a woman named Chandi Hefner in Hawaii. Hefner was 32, a Hare Krishna devotee from Baltimore, and within months, she had moved to Duke Farms, and the two of them were traveling the world together. It was Hefner who brought Bernard Lafferty into the household, which matters enormously later. Then, in 1988, Doris Duke went to a court in California and legally adopted her. Hefner was 35. Duke was 75. Duke also bought her a ranch in Hawaii, reported at $1 million. The reported explanation, and it should be taken as reported rather than established, is that Duke had come to believe Hefner was the reincarnation of Arden, the daughter who had lived one day in 1940. Duke had a serious interest in Eastern religion, and there are several accounts of her saying something along those lines. Whether she meant it literally is beyond anyone's ability to establish now. What is on the record is the legal instrument. An adult adoption in 1988 made Chandi Hefner her daughter in the eyes of the law, with everything that carries in an inheritance. It lasted about 3 years. Then it broke. Then it went to court. By 1991, the relationship had collapsed. Duke came to believe, or was encouraged to believe, that Hefner was after the estate. She cut off contact, and in her final will, she attempted to undo the adoption itself, stating that Hefner should be treated as though she had never been made her daughter. So the most documented family fight in Doris Duke's life is the one where she is the person going to court to sever a family tie. Hefner sued the estate after Duke died. In December of 1995, she settled for $65 million, in an agreement carrying no admission of wrongdoing by anyone. That settlement is also where Lafferty first agreed to loosen his grip on the estate. The disinherited daughter turned out to have more leverage over the butler than any court had managed to apply. $65 million is a fortune. Against $1.2 billion, it is a rounding error, and it bought the estate the disappearance of the only person on earth with a legal claim to be Doris Duke's child. The adoption had never been a gesture or a nickname. Under California law, it made a woman in her 30s the legal daughter of the richest heiress in the country, with every inheritance right that carries. And when Duke turned against it, she did not simply write Hefner out of the will. She asked that the fact of the daughter be erased, which left the house very quiet and one man standing in it: the butler. Bernard Lafferty was born in Creeslaw, County Donegal, in 1945. And orphaned at 17. He emigrated to Philadelphia and worked in hotels and theaters. And in the 1980s, he became a personal assistant to the singer Peggy Lee, who met him on tour. People who dealt with him described a man who drank and who could barely read. Chandy Hefner introduced him to Doris Duke, and in 1987, he was hired as a butler at Duke Farms. The adopted daughter hired the man who replaced her. 4 years later, she was gone, and he was not. He was hired as staff. 4 years later, he ran her life. That says more about her circumstances than about him. Consider who had already gone. Her parents were long dead, her mother in 1962. She had no siblings. Her only child had died in infancy 50 years earlier. Her adopted daughter had been cut off in 1991. Her closest friend of the 60s had died under her car. She had no colleagues because she had never held a job that could produce any, and no boss, and no board, and nobody whose professional duty it was to check on her. A person in that position has no ordinary mechanism by which anyone would notice something going wrong. Then her health went. In April of 1992, she had a facelift. Then came a fall and surgery on her leg and Cedars-Sinai. Accounts differ on exactly which bones and which operations. They agree that the recovery went badly and that more procedures followed. There was a long course of painkillers. Affidavits filed later by doctors describe periods of drug-induced confusion, including a report from March of 1993 that she had trouble locating her own elbow. The word isolation gets used loosely, so here is the machinery of it precisely. Duke had no legal guardian because nobody had ever asked a court for one. She had no power of attorney in force that anyone later pointed to. She had no children, no spouse, and no sibling with standing to petition. Her lawyers and her doctors were engaged by her household, which is to say, by the people in the house. In American law, a competent adult is entitled to be left alone, and the entire apparatus that might have checked on her was staffed by people whose employment depended on her being left alone. Through all of it, Lafferty was the constant. He managed the household, the access, the telephone, the schedule. Whether that was devotion or something else was argued over for years afterward and never resolved in any courtroom. She had changed her mind about who would handle it over and over. In 1987, the executor was Chandy Hefner. In March of 1991, it was her doctor, Harry Demopoulos. By that November, it was her accountant and a bank. In April of 1992, it was her nephew, Walker Inman, and Lafferty. By the end of that year, it was Lafferty alone. On the 5th of April, 1993, Doris Duke signed a new will. It repudiated the Hefner adoption. It left the bulk of the fortune to charity, and it named Bernard Lafferty, her butler of 6 years, as the sole individual executor of $1.2 billion. He was given the power to choose the bank that would act beside him, and the power to fire that bank. It left him $500,000 a year for life, an executor's fee that reporting at the time put as high as $5 million, and control of the foundation that would give the rest of it away. A few months before the end, she suffered a stroke. She died 6 months and 23 days after signing. The will also left $100,000 to look after her dogs, which tells you something about the shape of her obligations at the end. Was anyone in charge of her now? The question in the title gets its answer, and the answer is stranger than the question. Somebody did go to court to argue that Doris Duke had not been of sound mind. It happened after she was already ashes, and the person who did it was a doctor. Harry Demopoulos had been her physician, and an earlier version of her will had named him as executor. His motives were attacked on exactly that basis at the time. A man who stood to administer a billion-dollar estate under an old will, and who had borrowed $600,000 from her in 1989 for a company of his, has an obvious interest in the new one failing. It does not make him wrong. It does mean he was not a disinterested party, and no disinterested party ever appeared in this case at all. He challenged the April will in the New York County Surrogates Court, arguing that Duke had lacked testamentary capacity when she signed it and had been under undue influence from Lafferty and others around her. In January of 1995, several interested parties moved to have the executors removed, alleging waste of estate assets, commingling of funds, and substance abuse. Rather than hold a formal hearing, surrogate Eve Preminger appointed an investigator and gave him limited powers to go and find out. She chose Richard Koo, a former district attorney of Manhattan. Koo interviewed more than 50 people. His report concluded that Duke's death had been hastened by morphine, administered by her physician, Dr. Charles Kivowitz, and that her mental state at the signing of the will had been questionable. The other side filed back hard. Lafferty and 3 senior officers of the bank swore affidavits, and so did around 30 of Duke's employees, friends, physicians, and advisors, disputing what was in the report. On the 22nd of May, 1995, Preminger removed Lafferty and the trust company as co-executors, citing his spending and an unsecured loan of $825,000 the bank had made him. Then it came apart. The appeal was heard. The ruling went the other way. On the 11th of January, 1996, the New York Court of Appeals reversed her. The decision is matter of Duke, and the reasoning matters more than the headline it generated. The court held that Preminger had abused her discretion by removing the executors without giving them a hearing. The coup report she had relied on contained no sworn statements, and the identities of most of the people interviewed had never been disclosed, so the executors had no way to test any of it. The removal, the court said, rested largely on untested hearsay. The document that produced every murder headline was never evidence at all. Kivowitz has said he increased her morphine so that she would not suffer, and estimated it hastened her death by at most 2 days, which is a description of palliative care, and is also, on any reading, an admission that the timing was affected. Both of those things are in the record, and neither was ever tested at trial. The Los Angeles District Attorney investigated for around 18 months, including allegations made by a private nurse named Tammy Payette, and in July of 1996 announced there was no credible evidence of murder. No charges were ever brought against Kivowitz, against Lafferty, or against anybody else. Payette herself was separately convicted of stealing from patients she had worked for, which did nothing for her credibility as a witness. In May of 1996, the parties settled. The April will was admitted to probate, and every challenge to it was dropped. Lafferty gave up the executorship in exchange for an executor's fee of $4.5 million, on top of the $500,000 a year the will had already left him. Demopoulos, the doctor who had brought the challenge, took a seat on the board of the foundation. He collected it for 6 months. He died on the 4th of November, 1996, aged 51. The cause given was heart failure. He had bought himself a house in Bel Air and had a headboard made for it out of a door taken from a Newport mansion. What the gate is worth now. In the end, the money went where the will sent it. Her foundation reports assets of over $2.2 billion in its most recent filings, and gave away something over $60 million in a single recent year to medical research, the arts, the environment, and child protection. 3 decades after her death, the endowment is larger than the estate she left, which means the money has already outlasted everyone who fought over it, including everyone who was in the house. In her lifetime, she had already given away the equivalent of more than $400 million in today's money, a good deal of it anonymously, which is the part of her that almost never makes the headlines. The houses became public. Duke Farms in New Jersey, 2,700 acres, is open as an environmental center, Rough Point in Newport, where Eduardo Torella died at the gate, was handed to her Newport Preservation Foundation in 1999 and opened to the public the following year. Visitors walk in through the gate. Shangri-La in Honolulu holds her Islamic art collection and takes visitors by appointment. Falcon Lair was pulled down in 2006. What remains of it is the gate and the curve of the driveway. Bernard Lafferty has no grave near any of it. His own instructions were that his ashes go into the water off Hawaii, in the same ocean where he had scattered hers 3 years earlier. Whether that was the last act of a devoted servant or of a man who wanted to be near the money is the same question everybody had been arguing about since 1993, and it was never settled either. So, the question the court spent 3 years on: was anyone in charge of Doris Duke at the end? I do not think anyone can answer it now, and I have stopped expecting the documents to. The honest position is that the courts never established it, and the reason they could not is the finding underneath this whole story. There was nobody with the standing to raise it while she was alive. A relative could have, a child could have, a husband, a business partner, a colleague, anyone with a formal relationship and a reason to look. She had arranged a life with none of those people in it, and the arrangement worked exactly as designed for her whole adult life, right up until the point where it left her in a canyon house with her staff. What strikes me, reading through all of it, is how little of her survives in her own words. 80 years of photographs, thousands of column inches, 2 marriages covered like state occasions, and almost nothing where she is speaking for herself about any of it. I have gone looking, and it is mostly other people describing her, usually while asking for something. The tour of Rough Point includes a recording of her singing. That is close to the whole of what is left of her, in her own voice, in a house that people buy tickets for. Money and ground outlasted her, and very little else did. $2.2 billion in a foundation with her name on it, 2,700 acres in New Jersey, a house in Newport people pay to walk through, a collection of Islamic art above the Pacific. What did not survive is anyone to inherit any of it, which was settled in a delivery room in Honolulu in 1940 and never changed after that. And the gate in Benedict Canyon is still there, at the end of the driveway, with nothing behind it. Doris Duke spent her whole life on the other side of gates like that one, and the last thing anyone could agree on was who had been holding the key. One last thing. She left over $1 billion to strangers, and nothing to a single living relative. Tell me in the comments whether you read that as the clearest decision she ever made, or the saddest one. Hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.